The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds when Margaret Thompson picked up her sewing basket. She had been up since dawn, putting the final stitches on Mrs. Henderson's winter coat. The payment from this job would help her buy enough coal to last through the coming cold months. Margaret lived alone in a small wooden house on the edge of town. Her husband had died from fever 2 years ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and a handful of sewing skills her mother had taught her. At 28, she had grown used to the quiet life of mending clothes and staying close to home. The Dakota Territory was a harsh place for a woman alone. Most folks were kind enough, but they had their own troubles to worry about. Margaret had learned to depend on herself. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to think too much about the lonely evenings. That October morning felt different somehow. The air was thick and heavy, like something big was coming. Margaret had lived on the frontier long enough to know when weather was turning bad. But Mrs. Henderson needed her coat, and the ranch was only 5 miles out of town. She figured she could make the trip and be back before any real trouble started. She hitched up her old mare, Daisy, to the small wagon her husband had left behind. The horse wasn't much to look at, but she was steady and knew the roads well. Margaret wrapped the finished coat carefully in brown paper and placed it in the wagon bed along with 2 other mended items. The dirt road to the Henderson ranch was bumpy and full of ruts. Daisy picked her way carefully around the worst spots while Margaret watched the sky grow darker by the minute. The wind was picking up too, making the tall prairie grass bend and wave like an ocean. About halfway to the ranch, something caught Margaret's eye. Off to the left, near a cluster of scrub trees, she saw movement that didn't look like animals. She pulled Daisy to a stop and stood up in the wagon seat to get a better look. 2 small figures were walking across the open grassland. Even from a distance, Margaret could tell they were children. What were kids doing out here so far from any houses? And why were they walking straight into the path of what looked like a coming storm? Margaret had seen Sioux people in town before. They sometimes came to trade or buy supplies. Most white folks kept their distance, but Margaret had always been curious about their quiet dignity and the way they seemed to understand things about this land that she never would. These children looked lost. The little one, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, kept stumbling as the wind pushed against him. His older sister, Margaret could see now that it was a girl, was trying to help him along, but she was struggling too. Margaret felt her heart start to race. The smart thing would be to hurry on to the ranch, deliver her sewing, and get back to town before the weather got worse. That's what any sensible person would do. Getting involved with Indian children could cause all sorts of problems with some of the more narrow-minded folks in town. But as she watched, the little boy fell down completely. His sister was pulling on his arm, trying to get him back on his feet, but he seemed too tired or scared to stand. The wind was getting stronger every minute, and Margaret could see the wall of dark clouds moving closer across the sky. These weren't just any children. They were 2 small human beings in trouble, far from safety, with a dangerous storm bearing down on them. Margaret had lost her own chance at having children when her husband died. Maybe that's why her heart ached so much watching these 2 struggle against the wind. She made her decision without really thinking about it. Clicking her tongue to get Daisy moving, Margaret turned the wagon off the main road and headed across the grass toward the children. The wheels bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, but the old mare kept going. As she got closer, Margaret could see that both children had dark hair braided with small feathers and beads. The boy wore a simple brown shirt and leggings, while the girl had on a faded blue dress that had seen better days. Their clothes were too thin for the cold wind that was starting to bite. When the children saw the wagon approaching, they stopped walking and huddled together. Margaret could see the fear in their eyes. They had probably been taught to be wary of white people, just like she had been taught to be careful around Indians. Margaret climbed down from the wagon slowly, keeping her hands where the children could see them. She smiled and spoke in the gentlest voice she could manage over the wind. "Hello there," she called out. "Are you lost?" The children stared at her without answering. Of course they didn't speak English. Margaret felt foolish for not thinking of that right away. She tried using hand gestures instead, pointing to them and then to herself, trying to show that she wanted to help. The girl said something in their own language to the boy. Her voice was high and scared, but there was something protective in the way she stood in front of her little brother. Margaret recognized that fierce love between siblings. She had felt the same way about her own younger brother before he died of the same fever that took her parents. The wind gusted so hard that all three of them had to lean against it to stay upright. In the distance, Margaret could see the first flashes of lightning. This wasn't just going to be a regular autumn storm. This was shaping up to be one of those prairie blizzards that could kill anyone caught out in the open. Margaret pointed to her wagon and then made a sheltering motion with her arms. She hoped the children would understand that she was offering them protection, not harm. The girl looked uncertain, but when another strong gust of wind nearly knocked her brother over, she seemed to make up her mind. She spoke to the boy in their language, and he nodded. Together, they walked cautiously toward the wagon. Margaret helped lift the little boy into the back, wrapping him in the old quilt she kept there for cold mornings. The girl climbed up by herself, sitting protectively close to her brother. As Margaret climbed back onto the wagon seat, the first fat snowflakes began to fall. She looked back at the two children huddled in her wagon and realized that her simple trip to deliver mended clothes had just become something much more complicated and dangerous. The Henderson Ranch was still 2 miles away, but the storm was moving faster than she had expected. Margaret had to make another quick decision. Should she try to push on to the ranch, or should she head back toward town? Either way, they were going to be traveling right into the teeth of what was looking like a very bad blizzard. Daisy snorted and shook her mane as the snow began to fall harder. The old horse knew as well as Margaret did that they were in for trouble. But there was no choice now. She had 2 children depending on her, and she was going to do everything in her power to get them all to safety. Margaret snapped the reins and urged Daisy forward into the storm. Behind her, she could hear the children talking quietly to each other in voices that were brave but scared. She didn't know their names or where they had been trying to go, but it didn't matter now. For better or worse, their fates were tied together. The snow was falling so thick now that she could barely see 10 feet ahead of the wagon. The wind was howling like a living thing and the temperature was dropping fast. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about how quickly prairie storms could turn deadly. She had started this day as a simple seamstress making a routine delivery. Now she was responsible for 3 lives, her own and 2 children who couldn't even tell her their names. As the storm closed in around them, Margaret realized that nothing in her quiet, careful life had prepared her for what was coming next. But sometimes, life doesn't ask if you're ready. Sometimes it just hands you a moment where you have to choose between safety and doing what's right. Margaret had made her choice the instant she saw those children struggling against the wind. Now all 3 of them would have to live with the consequences. The storm hit them like a giant fist. One minute Margaret could still make out the shape of distant trees, and the next minute the world disappeared into a wall of white. The snow wasn't just falling anymore. It was flying sideways, driven by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Daisy stopped walking and planted her feet wide, refusing to take another step. Margaret couldn't blame the old mare. She could barely see the horse's ears, let alone the road ahead. The wagon rocked back and forth as the wind tried to tip it over. Behind her, Margaret heard the little boy crying. Not loud wailing, but the kind of quiet sobbing that breaks your heart. His sister was talking to him in their language, her voice trying to be calm but unable to hide her own fear. Margaret knew they were in serious trouble. She had heard stories about prairie blizzards that came up so fast they caught whole families outside. Some folks were found days later, frozen solid just yards from their own front doors. The cold could kill you in hours if you weren't careful. She tried to turn the wagon around to head back toward town, but the wheels just spun in place. The snow was already getting deep and it was piling up against the wagon like small mountains. Daisy whinnied nervously and tried to back up, but she couldn't get any traction either. "Easy, girl," Margaret called out, though she doubted the horse could hear her over the screaming wind. She climbed down from the wagon seat and immediately sank up to her knees in snow. The cold hit her like a slap in the face, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. Margaret struggled through the snow to Daisy's head and grabbed the bridle. The horse's eyes were wide with fear and ice was already forming on her mane. Margaret tried to lead her forward, but it was no use. They weren't going anywhere in this storm. She fought her way back to the wagon where the 2 children were huddled together under the quilt. Snow was blowing into the wagon bed, and both kids were shivering hard. The little boy's lips were starting to turn blue. Margaret had to think fast. They couldn't stay with the wagon. They would freeze to death in the open. But they couldn't travel either. She needed to find shelter, and she needed to find it right now. Through the swirling snow, Margaret tried to remember what she knew about this part of the prairie. There used to be a homestead somewhere around here. Old Pete Morrison had tried to farm this land a few years back, but he gave up after 2 bad seasons and moved back east. His cabin might still be standing, but which direction was it? In the whiteout, Margaret couldn't tell north from south. Everything looked the same, just endless swirling white. If she picked the wrong direction, they could wander in circles until they all froze. The girl in the wagon was looking at Margaret with eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She said something in her language and pointed off to the right. Margaret followed her gaze but saw nothing except snow. Still, these children had been traveling across this land. Maybe they knew something she didn't. Margaret made another split-second decision. She unhitched Daisy from the wagon and slapped the horse's rump, hoping the animal would have sense enough to find her own way to shelter. Then she gathered up the quilt and what few supplies she had in the wagon. "Come on," she called to the children, holding out her hands. "We can't stay here," the girl seemed to understand. She helped her brother climb down from the wagon, and together they formed a small chain, Margaret in front, the girl in the middle holding onto Margaret's coat, and the little boy at the back clinging to his sister. Step by step, they began moving in the direction the girl had pointed. The snow was so deep that Margaret had to lift her feet high with every step. The children were even smaller, and they kept sinking down until the snow was almost up to their chests. Margaret realized they weren't going to make it this way. The children were too small to fight through the deep snow, and they were all losing body heat fast. She stopped and turned around, scooping the little boy up in her arms. He was light as a feather but felt like ice against her body. The girl tried to keep walking, but she was struggling too. Margaret reached out and pulled her close, so all 3 of them were pressed together as they moved. She had no idea if they were going in the right direction, but standing still meant certain death. The wind was so loud it hurt her ears. Snow got into her eyes, her mouth, down the back of her neck. Margaret's feet were going numb and her arms ached from carrying the boy. But she kept putting one foot in front of the other. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, the girl tugged on her coat and pointed ahead. Through the blowing snow, Margaret could just make out a dark shape. It was low to the ground and didn't look like much, but it was definitely man-made. They stumbled toward it like people drowning who had spotted a piece of floating wood. As they got closer, Margaret could see it was indeed old Pete's cabin. The roof looked like it was sagging, and one of the windows was boarded up, but the walls were still standing. The door was stuck, frozen shut, or maybe warped from weather. Margaret set the boy down and threw her shoulder against it. Nothing. She tried again, harder this time, and heard something crack. On the 3rd try, the door burst open so suddenly that she almost fell inside. The cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter. Margaret quickly gathered the children inside and pushed the door shut behind them. The sudden quiet after hours of screaming wind was almost shocking. Margaret felt around in the darkness until she found what was left of old Pete's furniture. There was a broken chair, a rough table, and something that might have been a bed frame. More importantly, there was a small pile of wood scraps and some old newspapers. The children were shivering uncontrollably now. Margaret knew she had to get them warm fast, or the cold would kill them anyway. Storm or no storm. Her fingers were so numb she could barely strike a match. But finally she got a small fire going in the old fireplace. As the weak flames began to throw a little light around the cabin, Margaret got her first real look at the 2 children she had rescued. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 years old. His dark eyes were huge in his thin face, and he was trying very hard not to cry. His sister looked about 8, with the same dark eyes and the kind of serious expression children get when they've had to grow up too fast. Neither of them spoke, but their eyes followed Margaret's every move. She knew they were probably wondering if they could trust this strange, white woman who had taken them from their wagon and brought them to this abandoned place. Margaret wished she could tell them that. Everything was going to be all right, but she wasn't sure that was true. They had shelter now and a small fire, but she didn't know how long the storm would last or when anyone would come looking for them. Outside, the wind continued to howl like something alive and angry. Snow was already piling up against the cabin walls, and the temperature was still dropping. Margaret realized that saving the children from the open prairie might have been the easy part. Now came the hard part, keeping all 3 of them alive until the storm passed. And she had no idea how long that might be. The little fire flickered in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Margaret pulled the children closer to the weak warmth and tried to think of what to do next. They were alive, they were out of the wind, and they were together. For now, that would have to be enough. The first night was the longest of Margaret's life. The three of them huddled together near the small fire, listening to the storm rage outside. Every few hours, Margaret had to break up more of old Pete's furniture to keep the flames going. She worried about what would happen when the wood ran out. The children were exhausted, but they couldn't really sleep. Every time the wind shook the cabin walls, they would jolt awake and look around with frightened eyes. Margaret tried humming softly to comfort them, old songs her mother used to sing. It seemed to help a little. Around midnight, the little boy started shivering so hard his teeth were chattering. Margaret realized his thin clothes were still damp from the snow. She helped him out of his wet shirt and wrapped him in part of the quilt, then held him close to her body to share her warmth. The girl watched this with careful eyes. Margaret could tell she was protective of her brother, and wasn't sure whether to trust this stranger. But when Margaret held out her arm, the girl slowly moved closer and let herself be included in the warmth. By morning, the storm was still going strong. Margaret crept to the boarded-up window and peered through a crack. All she could see was white. Snow was piled halfway up the cabin walls, and it was still coming down hard. Margaret's stomach was growling, and she knew the children must be hungry too. She had grabbed her small lunch from the wagon, just 2 biscuits and a piece of cheese. It wasn't much to split between 3 people, but it was all they had. She broke the food into small pieces and offered some to each child. The boy ate eagerly, but the girl only took a tiny bite and then tried to give the rest to her brother. Margaret gently pushed her hand back, making it clear that the food was for her to keep. "We all eat," Margaret said firmly, even though she knew they couldn't understand her words. She hoped they would understand her meaning. The second day was harder. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and their supply of burnable furniture was getting low. Margaret had to venture outside to gather snow for drinking water, fighting against wind that nearly knocked her down just in the few steps to the door. The children followed her every move with worried eyes. Margaret could tell they were scared, but they were also remarkably calm for kids their age. She wondered what their lives had been like before this storm. Had they learned early that sometimes you just had to endure hard things without complaining? On the second night, Margaret woke up to find the little boy burning with fever. His forehead was hot and he was breathing in short, quick gasps. Margaret's heart sank. She had seen this before. Sometimes the cold and stress could make children sick very quickly. She melted some snow and used her handkerchief to wipe his face with cool water. The girl sat close by, holding her brother's hand and speaking to him in their language. Her voice was gentle and reassuring, like a mother comforting a baby. Margaret wished desperately that she could talk to them. She wanted to know their names, where they had been going, whether their family was looking for them. More than that, she wanted to be able to comfort them with words instead of just gestures. By the third morning, their situation was getting desperate. They were down to the last few pieces of wood, and Margaret's 2 biscuits were long gone. The boy's fever was worse, and all 3 of them were getting weak from hunger. But something had changed in how the children looked at her. The girl no longer watched Margaret with suspicious eyes. Instead, she tried to help with small tasks, like gathering up wood scraps or arranging the quilt to keep them all warmer. The boy, even in his fever, would reach for Margaret's hand when he was scared. Margaret realized that somewhere in their shared struggle, the 3 of them had become a family of sorts. They couldn't talk to each other, but they had learned to communicate in other ways. A touch on the shoulder meant "I'm here." Sharing the last sip of water meant "we're in this together." Sitting close by the fire meant "you're not alone." On the third day, Margaret made a difficult decision. They were going to starve if they stayed in the cabin much longer, and the boy needed help she couldn't give. She decided to try burning some pages from an old almanac she had found, and then attempt to signal for help. She tore out pages from the almanac and fed them carefully to the fire, trying to create as much smoke as possible. Then she climbed up on the rickety table and managed to knock a hole in part of the roof. If anyone was out there looking for them, maybe they would see the smoke. The girl seemed to understand what Margaret was trying to do. She gathered up some of the remaining paper and handed it to Margaret, then pointed upward and nodded. Even the sick boy tried to help by pointing to more things they could burn. By afternoon of the third day, Margaret noticed that the wind outside didn't sound quite as fierce as before. She managed to push the cabin door open a few inches and saw that the snow had stopped falling. The world outside was still white and cold, but the blizzard was finally moving on. Margaret felt a flutter of hope, but she also knew they were still in danger. They were weak from hunger and cold, and the boy was getting sicker. Even if the storm was over, they might not survive much longer without help. As the day wore on, Margaret kept the small fire going and tried to keep the children's spirits up. She showed them how to play simple hand games and taught them to clap along with songs, even though they couldn't understand the words. The girl was quick to learn and seemed to enjoy the games. She even taught Margaret a clapping pattern that must have been from her own culture. For a few minutes at a time, they could almost forget how much trouble they were in. But as night began to fall on their third day in the cabin, Margaret faced the hard truth. The boys' fever was worse, their food was completely gone, and she didn't know if her smoke signals had been seen by anyone. She had saved these children from the storm, but now she wondered if she had only delayed the inevitable. The three of them had found each other in the worst circumstances imaginable, but would it be enough to save their lives? Outside, the prairie night was cold and still. Inside the cabin, Margaret held the two children close and tried to believe that somehow, someone would find them in time. All they could do now was wait and hope that their luck would hold for just a little bit longer. Margaret woke up on the fourth morning to a sound she had almost forgotten: complete silence. The howling wind that had been their constant companion for 3 days was finally gone. Weak sunlight was filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls. She carefully moved away from the sleeping children and crept to the window. What she saw outside made her heart leap. The snow had stopped completely and the sky was clear blue. Better yet, she could see dark shapes moving in the distance. People on horseback, spread out across the white prairie like they were searching for something. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to get a fire going in the fireplace. They were down to burning the last few pages of the almanac, but she needed to create smoke, lots of it. This might be their only chance. The girl woke up and immediately noticed the change in Margaret's behavior. She shook her little brother gently, and even though he was still feverish, he managed to sit up and look around. Margaret pointed toward the window and then up at the smoke starting to rise from their fire. "Help," she said, knowing they wouldn't understand the word but hoping they would understand her excitement. "People coming." The girl's eyes widened and she quickly went to the window to look out. When she saw the distant riders, she started speaking rapidly in her own language. Her brother tried to get up, but he was too weak and dizzy. Margaret threw more paper on the fire, creating a thick column of smoke that poured up through the hole in the roof. She climbed back on the table and waved a piece of cloth through the opening, hoping the movement would catch someone's attention. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Margaret alternated between feeding the fire and waving the cloth. The riders in the distance seemed to be moving in their direction, but it was hard to tell. Then she heard it, voices calling out in the crisp morning air. Some were shouting in English, but others were calling in the same language the children spoke. Margaret felt tears of relief running down her cheeks. The girl heard the voices too and began calling back, her young voice carrying surprisingly far in the still air. She was shouting what sounded like names, and soon Margaret could hear answering calls getting closer and closer. The little boy tried to join his sister in calling out, but his voice was weak from fever. Margaret helped him sit up against the wall where he could at least hear what was happening. Soon Margaret could hear the sound of horses breathing hard and people talking excitedly right outside the cabin. Someone pounded on the door and a man's voice called out in English, "Anyone in there? We're looking for 2 missing children. We're here," Margaret shouted back, her voice cracking with emotion. "3 of us. We're alive." The door burst open and suddenly the small cabin was full of people. Margaret saw men from town, the sheriff, Doc Patterson, and several other faces she recognized. But there were also several Sioux men, including an older man with silver hair and a face marked by wisdom and worry. The silver-haired man pushed through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside the children. The girl threw herself into his arms, crying and speaking rapidly in their language. The man held her tight, and Margaret could see tears streaming down his weathered face. One of the other Sioux men gently lifted the sick boy and examined him with careful hands. He spoke to the older man, and Margaret caught a tone of concern in his voice. "This is Chief Standing Bear," the sheriff explained to Margaret. "These are his grandchildren." The whole tribe has been out looking for them since the storm started. Margaret watched as Chief Standing Bear stood up and walked over to her. He was a tall man with kind but penetrating eyes. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You saved my grandchildren," he said simply. "How can I thank you?" Margaret felt embarrassed by all the attention. "I just did what anyone would do," she said. "They needed help." "No," the chief said firmly. "Not anyone would risk their life in a blizzard for children who are not their own. Not anyone would share their food and warmth with strangers." Doc Patterson was examining the little boy whose fever was making him delirious. "We need to get this child to town right away," he said. "He's got pneumonia setting in." Chief Standing Bear spoke quickly to one of his men, who nodded and carefully lifted the boy. The girl didn't want to leave her brother's side, staying close as they prepared to take him outside. "My daughter and her children were traveling to visit relatives," the chief explained to Margaret as they prepared to leave the cabin. "When the storm hit, they got separated. We found her yesterday, safe but worried sick about Little Fox and Morning Star." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest at finally learning the children's names. Little Fox, that fit the brave but fragile boy, and Morning Star, perfect for his protective sister. As they all made their way outside, Margaret was amazed to see how many people were gathered on the prairie. There must have been 20 riders, both white and Sioux, all working together to find 2 lost children. Chief Standing Bear helped Margaret onto one of the horses, and she found herself riding beside Morning Star, who was mounted behind one of her relatives. The girl reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand, her eyes saying everything that words couldn't express. The ride back to town was like something from a dream. Margaret had left 3 days ago as a lonely seamstress making a simple delivery. Now she was returning as the woman who had saved the chief's grandchildren, surrounded by people who were treating her like a hero. But all Margaret could think about was Little Fox, lying so still and hot with fever in the arms of the man carrying him. She had kept him alive through the worst of the storm, but would it be enough? As they reached the edge of town, Margaret could see crowds of people lining the main street. Word had spread fast that the missing children had been found, but she could also see a woman running toward them, crying and calling out in the Sioux language. "Their mother," Chief Standing Bear said quietly to Margaret. "Blue Wing Woman? She has not slept since her children disappeared?" Margaret watched as Blue Wing Woman reached them and took her daughter into her arms, both of them crying and talking at the same time. When the woman saw her sick son, she let out a wail that broke Margaret's heart. Doc Patterson took charge, directing everyone toward his office where he could properly treat Little Fox. As they all moved through town, Margaret realized that something important had happened on that prairie. These 2 communities, one white, one Sioux, had worked together as one people to save 2 children. Maybe it had taken a crisis to show them that they were more alike than different. Maybe it had taken a storm to wash away some of the fear and mistrust that usually kept them apart. As they reached Doc Patterson's office, Chief Standing Bear turned to Margaret one more time. "You have given me back my grandchildren," he said. "Now you are family to us always." Margaret didn't know what to say. She had started this journey as a woman with no family, no real connections to anyone. Now somehow she had found herself part of something bigger than she had ever imagined. The rescue was over, but Margaret had a feeling that her real adventure was just beginning. Little Fox fought the pneumonia for a week. Margaret spent most of those days in Doc Patterson's office, helping Blue Wing Woman care for her son. Even though they couldn't speak each other's language, the 2 women understood each other perfectly. They were both mothers at heart, willing to do anything to help a sick child. Morning Star rarely left her brother's side either. She would sit by his bed for hours, holding his hand and singing soft songs in their language. Margaret was amazed by the strength of this little girl who had been through so much, but never stopped believing her brother would get better. On the 7th day, Little Fox's fever finally broke. Margaret was dozing in a chair beside his bed when she heard his small voice whisper something in Sioux. She opened her eyes to see him looking around the room with clear, alert eyes. Blue Wing Woman started crying with relief and called for Doc Patterson. Morning Star hugged her brother gently, chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to show him. Margaret felt tears running down her own cheeks as she watched the family reunion. That same day, Chief Standing Bear came to visit with several other tribal elders. They spoke quietly with Blue Wing Woman for a long time, occasionally glancing over at Margaret. She wondered what they were discussing but didn't want to interrupt. Finally, the chief approached Margaret with a serious expression on his weathered face. "We would like to speak with you," he said formally. "Will you come to our camp tomorrow evening?" "There is something important we must discuss." Margaret agreed, though she felt nervous about what they might want to talk about. Had she done something wrong? Were they upset that she had interfered with their children? The next evening, Margaret rode out to the Sioux camp with a mixture of curiosity and worry. She had never been to an Indian village before, and she didn't know what to expect. What she found surprised her. The camp was larger than she had imagined, with dozens of tipis arranged in careful patterns. Children played between the tents while women worked on various tasks and men tended to horses. It looked like any other community, just with different buildings and customs. Chief Standing Bear met her at the edge of camp and led her to a large teepee in the center. Inside, several elders were seated in a circle, including Blue Wing Woman and the parents of Little Fox and Morning Star. The chief spoke for several minutes in his own language, and Margaret caught the children's names and her own name mentioned several times. Then he turned to her and switched to English. "We have decided to make you a daughter of our tribe," he said solemnly. "You risked your life to save our children. You showed kindness when you could have looked away. You are now family to all of us." Margaret was stunned. She had heard of adoption ceremonies, but never imagined she would be part of one. "I'm honored," she managed to say, "but I don't know anything about your customs or your language." "That can be learned," the chief smiled. "What matters is what's in your heart, and your heart has already shown us who you are." Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself spending more and more time at the Sioux camp. Blue Wing Woman taught her basic words and phrases, while Morning Star delighted in showing her how to bead and do other traditional crafts. Little Fox, fully recovered now, would run up to hug her whenever she arrived, chattering away in Sioux as if she could understand every word. But Margaret's real education came from watching how the two communities, White and Sioux, had started working together since the rescue. The shared experience of searching for the lost children had broken down barriers that had existed for years. Farmers were trading with tribal members more freely. Some of the Sioux men helped townspeople repair storm damage, while white families shared surplus food with tribal families who had lost supplies in the blizzard. It wasn't perfect, there was still mistrust on both sides, but it was a start. Margaret realized she was in a unique position. As someone accepted by both communities, she could help build bridges between them. She started small, translating during trading sessions and helping settle minor disputes. But soon, people from both sides were coming to her for help with bigger problems. 6 months after the storm, Margaret was approached by the town council and the tribal elders with an unusual request. They wanted her to start a school that would serve children from both communities. The idea was revolutionary. Indian and white children learning together in the same classroom. "It won't be easy," warned Mayor Johnson, a kind but practical man. "Some folks on both sides aren't going to like it." "Change never is easy," replied Chief Standing Bear. "But our children saved each other during that storm. Maybe they can teach the grown-ups how to do the same." Margaret accepted the challenge, though she had never taught school before. With help from both communities, they converted an old warehouse into a classroom. Margaret spent her evenings learning more of the Sioux language, while studying teaching methods during the day. The first day of school was tense. Some white parents brought their children but stayed to watch suspiciously. Some Sioux families did the same. Margaret had 8 students total, 4 from each community, including Morning Star and Little Fox. But children, Margaret discovered, don't carry the same fears as adults. Within a week, the kids were playing together at recess and helping each other with lessons. Morning Star became best friends with Beth, a shy white girl whose father ran the general store. Little Fox formed a close bond with Tommy, the blacksmith's son. Margaret taught them all to read and write in English, but she also learned Sioux stories and customs to share with the white children. She brought in elders from both communities to teach about their different traditions and histories. The school's success spread beyond the classroom. Parents who had never spoken to each other started talking while waiting to pick up their children. Families began inviting each other to dinners and celebrations. Slowly, the artificial barriers that had separated the two communities began to crumble. 2 years after the storm, Margaret was preparing for another school year when she received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Crow Feather was a young man who had been educated at a college back east and had returned to help his people navigate the changing world. Chief Standing Bear had asked him to work with Margaret on expanding educational opportunities for both communities. Thomas was intelligent, gentle, and shared Margaret's passion for building bridges between cultures. As they worked together on developing new programs for the school, Margaret found herself looking forward to their daily planning sessions for reasons that had nothing to do with education. Their courtship was unusual by the standards of either community, but both families supported the match. Thomas respected Margaret's independence and dedication to her work, while Margaret admired his wisdom and commitment to justice for all people. They were married in a ceremony that blended traditions from both cultures. The wedding was held outdoors, with Chief Standing Bear performing the Sioux rituals and the town minister handling the Christian parts. The entire community, both white and Sioux, attended the celebration. As Margaret stood beside her new husband, watching Little Fox and Morning Star playing with children of all backgrounds, she marveled at how much her life had changed. 3 years ago, she had been a lonely widow with no family and few prospects. Now she was surrounded by people who loved her, and important work that gave meaning to her days. The storm that had nearly killed them all had instead transformed not just Margaret's life, but the lives of everyone in both communities. It had shown them that when people work together, they can overcome anything, whether it's a blizzard, prejudice, or fear of the unknown. Margaret and Thomas went on to establish schools in 3 other frontier towns, always with the same philosophy, that children of different backgrounds learning together would create a better future for everyone. They raised 4 children of their own, who grew up speaking both English and Sioux and saw cultural differences as something to celebrate rather than fear. Years later, when Morning Star and Little Fox were grown with children of their own, they would tell the story of the storm and the white woman who saved them, but they always ended the story the same way, by saying that Margaret didn't just save them from the blizzard. She saved them from a world where people stayed afraid of each other instead of learning to be family. The storm had indeed nearly taken them away, but instead it had brought them all together and changed not just their fates, but the fate of an entire community. And that, Margaret always believed, was the real miracle. Not that they had survived the storm, but that they had learned to see the humanity in each other and build something beautiful from that recognition. Sometimes the worst storms in life don't destroy us. Sometimes they clear away everything unnecessary and show us what really matters. For Margaret, that storm had blown away her old, small life and given her a new one filled with purpose, love, and the kind of family she never could have imagined. One that transcended all the artificial boundaries people create, and was based instead on the simple truth that we all need each other to survive.